There is a moment that the county still talks about, though the telling of it depends entirely on who is doing the talking. If you ask Gerald Fitch, and people rarely do anymore, he will say there was some confusion about the paperwork, that he was only trying to protect a young woman who didn't understand what she had gotten herself into. But if you ask anyone who was standing in the Harlow barn that September afternoon, when the afternoon light came through the slats in long amber bars, and dust hung in the air like gold powder, and Marin Harlow unrolled that deed on the work table and smoothed it flat with both hands and said, "Nothing at all," they will tell you that silence can be louder than any room full of shouting. They will tell you that a woman can be entirely, devastatingly right without raising her voice once. And they will tell you, almost always with something between a laugh and a shake of the head, about the 15 trees, 15 peach trees that nobody wanted, on land nobody valued, tended by a woman nobody believed. 3 years earlier, in the spring of 1889, the 15 trees were the reason her neighbors had crossed the road rather than look her in the face. That is where this story truly begins. The Harlow farm sat at the eastern edge of Caldwell County, Missouri, where the good bottomland rolled away toward the river and the soil went from dark and willing to thin and grudging within about a quarter mile. Marin had inherited the farm at 22 when her uncle died without a will worth the paper it was written on, and with debts that took the livestock, the good equipment, the grain stores, and nearly the north field. What remained? 12 acres of scrub-hard clay ground, a barn that leaned like a man catching his breath, a farmhouse that needed more work than it would reward. And along the east ridge, so close to the tree line that most people hadn't even noticed them, 15 peach trees of a variety nobody in the county seemed to be able to name, fell to Marin because no creditor thought it worth seizing. She had come to help her uncle the summer before his death, having worked since she was 16 in her cousin's household 3 towns east, and the county's verdict on her arrival to take ownership of the farm was delivered, as county verdicts always are, quickly and without appeal. A young woman alone could not run a place like this. A young woman alone had no business trying to coax a crop from ground that had given the Harlow men nothing. A young woman alone would sell inside of 6 months, take what little was offered, and go back to wherever she'd come from. This was not cruelty, exactly. It was a kind of comfortable certainty, the way a whole community can agree on a thing that has never actually been tested, and call it wisdom. Marin heard all of this because a small county does not bother to lower its voice. She heard Marcus Spicer at the feed store tell another man that she had likely never in her life planted so much as a kitchen garden. She heard the women at the dry goods counter say it with something they meant as sympathy. It was such a shame. The farm was a burden no single woman could manage. They hoped she had family somewhere who would take her in. She heard all of it, and she noted it, and she added it quietly to a private ledger she kept in no book anyone would ever find. Then she went back to the farm and began. The old neighbor who found her there one evening in early April was a man named August Brandt. He was Hungarian by birth, Missouri by 60 years of habit, and he had the kind of face that had been weathering since before the war. He grew apples on the western edge of his land, small and tart, and nothing a market man would look at twice. But his winter cider was a matter of local legend that even the people who disliked him respected. He came over the ridge on a mule, ostensibly to check the fence line they shared, and found Marin on her knees at the base of one of the 15 peach trees, her hands in the dirt around the roots, her face close enough to the bark that she was practically listening to it. He watched her for a while before he said anything. When he did, his voice carried that particular gentleness of people who have stopped needing to perform. "You know what kind they are?" he asked. She looked up. "Not yet," she said, "but they leafed out first on the ridge. Everything else is still waiting." He got down from the mule and came to look. He put his own hand to the bark the way you would with an old horse to let it know you were there, and he was quiet for a moment. "My father grew something like this," he said finally, "in the old country, very early, very sweet when they come. The skin is thin, so they do not travel well, but the taste—" He paused. He seemed to be locating the taste in memory. "There is no comparison," he said. "People used to come a long way for them." "What happened to them?" Marin asked. August was quiet for another beat. "Nobody thought they were worth the trouble," he said. He looked at her then with a directness that was not unkind, and she looked back, and something was settled between them that neither of them would put into words for a very long time. She did not tell anyone what August told her next. She banked it, the way you bank a coal under ash to keep it through the night, and she went to work on everything else the farm demanded before she could afford to think about the trees again. That spring she repaired the barn roof with lumber she traded a week's labor to obtain. She broke ground on a kitchen garden and planted it with seeds she bought with money, so carefully counted it still makes the arithmetic painful to follow. 40 cents for beans, $1.12 for squash and melon, 30 cents for the tomatoes she would sell door to door come August if she had to. She turned the north field by hand with the one mule she'd managed to acquire, a sway-backed animal her neighbors openly pitied, and she planted it in winter wheat because winter wheat was what she could afford, and because the ground, she had decided, was not as bad as everyone had told her. It had been badly managed. That was different from bad. The town watched. It did not help, but it watched, which is its own kind of company, she supposed. By June she was thin in a way that was not quite hunger, but was only a few bad weeks away from it, and she had moved the arithmetic from a general worry to a precise nightly calculation. What she had, what she would need to last until the wheat came, what the kitchen garden might yield, where each dollar would have to come from, and where it could not. She did this the way a navigator does it in fog, not because the certainty makes the fog any thinner, but because the act of calculating is itself a kind of hand on the wheel. The 15 trees fruited in July. She had not expected it quite so soon, and the morning she walked the east ridge and saw the color on them, a blush so deep it was almost red, where all the other peach trees she had ever seen in that county ran to yellow. She stopped walking and stood still in the way you do when something startles you into attention. She picked one fruit and bit into it standing there in the early light, juice running down her wrist, and she understood in that moment why August had gone quiet, looking for the memory of the taste. There was no comparison. It was sweet the way a thing is sweet when the sweetness has been concentrating itself for a long time in difficult ground, the way hardship renders down into something almost unbearably fine. She picked the crop alone over 4 days. 15 trees, even modestly fruiting after years of what had clearly been inattentive care, gave her more peaches than she had boxes for, and she solved this problem by making peach preserves until her hands were stained amber and her kitchen smelled like summer, condensed to its essence. She sold the fresh fruit quietly, door to door, charging what she thought was fair. She sold out in a single afternoon. She said nothing about where they came from. She went back to the farm, and in the evenings, when the light was low and the work was briefly done, she went to the east ridge and sat with the trees, and she looked at the pits she had saved from the fruit she had eaten herself. And she thought about what August had told her. He had told her this: the trees were not simply peach trees. They were a variety so old it had been largely abandoned, a fruit that ripened 3 weeks before any other in the region, and did it with a flavor that made everything grown afterward taste like an apology. They could not be shipped. The skin was too thin, the fruit too yielding. It would bruise to mush in a wagon before it reached the market 12 miles away. This was why no one grew them commercially. This was why they had been forgotten. But here, sold fresh, sold to people standing close enough to smell them, they were not merely valuable. They were something else entirely. They were irreplaceable. She spent that winter learning to graft. August came over the ridge twice a week through January and February, stamping snow off his boots at her porch steps, and they sat at her kitchen table with a lamp between them, while he showed her, on cut branches from his apple stock, the technique of the whip and tongue graft, the cleft graft for older wood, how to bind the union tight enough to hold but not so tight it strangled the growth. His hands were the hands of a man who had done this for 50 years, and his instruction was patient and detailed in the way that knowledge becomes when it has been hard won. Maren practiced on wood, then on dormant rootstock. She'd ordered from a nursery at a cost that made her pause over the ledger for a long time before she put the pencil down and wrote the number anyway. By March, she had 38 grafted saplings overwintering in the warmest corner of the barn, each one wrapped in burlap, each one tended with a care she would not have been able to explain to anyone who asked, because the explaining would have required saying what she intended, and she was not ready for that yet. The wheat came in that May better than she had dared to count on, and the kitchen garden that summer produced with a generosity that surprised even her. She was not comfortable, but she was no longer in the particular cold arithmetic of bare survival. The kitchen was not empty. The ledger was not bleeding. She replanted the 15 mother trees root zone with a cover crop August recommended, fed them with composted material she'd been building for 8 months, and watched them through the summer with the focused attention of someone who has learned to read a language most people walk past without noticing. The grafted saplings went into the ground that fall in 2 new rows she had cleared on the east ridge, widening the orchard. 38 new trees planted at the spacing August specified, staked against the November wind. She did the arithmetic. If they established through the winter, if they fruited in 3 years as rootstock grafted trees of this type could be expected to. She paused over that if for a long while in the dark, because it was the kind of if that a single failed winter could erase entirely. She would have 53 trees producing the fruit that nobody in this county could buy anywhere else. The arithmetic of that was not comfort. It was something closer to a fixed point in the dark, something to navigate by. She did not tell the town what she was doing. The town, for its part, had by this time partially revised its estimate of her to the position that she was stubborn and possibly peculiar, but probably would manage to scrape along, which in Caldwell County in 1890 was practically a standing ovation. The man who would later be the main difficulty was named Gerald Fitch. He ran the county's largest produce operation, supplying markets in 3 adjacent counties, and he had a way of arriving at a farm with his hat in his hands and his voice full of concern that tended to end with the farmer signing something they hadn't fully read. He had come to see Maren in the second summer when the fresh peach sales door to door had gotten back to him through the particular underground of a small county's commerce. He sat at her kitchen table and drank her coffee and called her Miss Harlow in a tone that was almost fatherly, and he told her that he'd heard she had some interesting fruit and that he wanted to help her find a market for it. He could move volume, he said. He had the wagons and the roots and the buyer relationships. Someone in her position, working alone, without the scale to reach real market, was leaving real money on the table. Maren listened to all of this with the expression she had perfected over 2 years of being underestimated, which was a kind of pleasant attentiveness that gave away nothing. She asked him what price he was proposing per bushel. He named a number. She said she would think about it. He left, and she thought about it for approximately as long as it took her to walk to the East Ridge and look at the trees, which was not very long at all. The number he had named was a third of what her door-to-door customers had paid without complaint. He had counted on her not knowing that, or not being able to do better. She was not sure which assumption annoyed her more. That fall, she wrote a letter to a hotel kitchen in Kansas City, whose name she had gotten from the wife of a grain merchant who had tasted one of her preserves at a church gathering, and written down a name with the urgency of a woman solving a problem. She did not expect a reply quickly. She was not a woman who required quick answers from the world. She went on working. The winter that followed was the first hard test of the new orchard, and it was harder than she had prepared for, and not as hard as she had feared, which she later decided was about the best outcome you could honestly hope for in Missouri in January. 3 of the grafted saplings did not make it. She lost them to a freeze that came in without warning in the second week of the new year, a cold that settled into the ridge and stayed for 11 days and turned the ground to something like iron. She walked the rows in the aftermath and counted, and she stood for a moment with her hand on the bark of the first dead tree, feeling the particular quality of wood that has stopped being alive. And then she went back to the barn and checked on the remaining 35 with a care that was almost ferocious. They were all right. Most of them were all right. By the third spring she had 35 new trees and the original 15, and the first of the grafted saplings, the most vigorous ones she had planted first, were beginning to bud in that distinctive way she had learned to watch for. A slightly earlier flush than anything else on the ridge, leaves unfolding with a readiness that looked almost eager against the still bare branches of the tree line behind them. She had her answer from the hotel kitchen by then, a letter from a man named Everett Cole, who was the purchasing manager for the Stafford Hotel and who wrote in the tightly controlled hand of a man accustomed to contracts, asking whether she might send a sample quantity and a price. She sent 12 peaches packed in sawdust in a wooden box she had reinforced at every corner with a letter that stated a price per case, that she had calculated based on what the fruit would fetch, sold fresh at the door, minus exactly what she considered fair for the trouble of packing and the uncertainty of shipping, which she priced at almost nothing because she needed the relationship more than she needed the margin on this first delivery. The letter that came back from Everett Cole contained a purchase order for every case she could supply for the remainder of the season, at a price 10% above what she had asked. It also contained a personal note, written in a looser hand at the bottom of the typed page, that said only, "We put one on the plate of a guest who has eaten in Paris and London and New York, and he asked the waiter to find out where they came from. Please plant more trees." She read this standing at the kitchen table in the early morning with the lamp still on because the sun wasn't yet up, and she did not whoop or cry or run to find someone to tell. She put the letter flat on the table and smoothed it the way she had smoothed the deed, and she was quiet for a moment. Then she went to the barn to begin the day's work. She told August, because August had earned it. She walked over the ridge that evening with the letter in her coat pocket and found him in his apple rose. And she handed him the letter without saying anything. And he read it standing there in the orchard light. And when he looked up, his expression was the one she had come to understand was his version of a wide smile, a particular quality of stillness that meant something had gone right in the world. "New," he said, which in his usage meant something close to, "so there we are," or "I told you so," without any of the gloating of either. "Now you plant more trees," he said. "I already have the rootstock," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then he did actually smile. "Of course you do," he said. The next 2 growing seasons built on each other the way good seasons do when the groundwork is honest, not in sudden leaps, but in steady accumulation, each yield a little larger, each process a little more refined. She hired a girl of 14 named Cora Bisson, whose family farmed the difficult ground 2 miles south, and who came to Marin with a seriousness entirely out of proportion to her age, and a desire to learn that made the teaching a genuine pleasure. Cora could pick a row in the time it took most grown workers to do half, and she had the instinct for which fruit was ready that some people never develop no matter how long they work at it. The ability to read a fruit by color and give and stem without having to think about it consciously. Marin paid her a fair wage and taught her grafting in the winter months, and Cora took to the work with the focused intensity of someone who has found the thing they were meant to do. The orchard by the end of the 3rd full season numbered 61 trees, including 11 new grafted saplings from cuttings she'd carefully taken from her most productive mother trees. The arithmetic had long since shifted from survival to something she had not quite named yet. a word she did not want to use prematurely in case the ground shifted again. She was not comfortable using the word security. She was not comfortable assuming the ground under her would hold. It was Gerald Fitch who made it shift. He had not gone away, as she had perhaps allowed herself to hope. He had watched her operation grow with the particular attention of a man who has been made to wait for something he considers already his. And in the late summer of the 4th year he appeared again at her kitchen door with his hat in his hands and his voice of careful concern, and this time what he brought was not a price offer. It was a man from the county assessor's office named Crandall, who had a leather satchel and a manner of looking at the corners of rooms that Marin associated with people who were looking for discrepancies. Fitch introduced him with great warmth and explained, with the smooth regret of someone who had been practicing his regret, that there was some question about the eastern boundary of the Harlow property, the tree-line boundary specifically, and that Mr. Crandall had come out to review the survey markers, which might, it turned out, establish that a portion of the East Ridge was in fact not within the original Harlow deed, a situation that would be most unfortunate for someone who had planted, he understood, quite a considerable number of trees there. He said this with the expression of a man delivering bad news he genuinely wishes he did not have to deliver, and it was such a thorough performance that a person who did not know him might have been moved by it. Marin looked at him for a moment. She looked at Mr. Crandall. She said she would make coffee. She went to the kitchen, and she did make coffee, because her hands needed something to do while she thought, and while the coffee was going, she went to the shelf where she kept the deed and the survey records she had obtained from the county recorder's office in the first month after inheriting the farm, at a time when she had already understood that she would need to know exactly what she had and where its edges were. She brought these to the table with the coffee, and she set them in front of Gerald Fitch and Mr. Crandall, and she waited while they looked at them. The survey she had filed was current. The boundary markers on the East Ridge had been re-established 2 years prior by a licensed surveyor she had hired when she was first planning the expanded orchard, at a cost that had hurt, but that she had understood, even then, was not optional. The East Ridge was unambiguously within the Harlow deed. Every tree she had ever planted was on her own ground, Mr. Crandall cleared his throat. He shuffled through his own papers. He looked at her survey with the expression of a man who has arrived at a party to find it already over. Fitch's voice had lost some of its careful warmth. He said there might still be some question about the original Harlow conveyance, some irregularity in the chain of title, a matter he would of course want to look into on her behalf. Someone in her position, navigating this alone, could really use a reliable partner who understood how these county matters worked. He was thinking about her well-being, he said. Marin put both her hands flat on the table, the way she had on the deed 3 years ago. She said, "Mr. Fitch, you asked my neighbors last April how many trees I had on the East Ridge." He started to say something. She continued, "My neighbor told me. He also told me the number he gave you was the number you repeated to Mr. Crandall when you filed your inquiry, which means you already knew exactly how many trees were there before you came today with a question about the boundary. And a man who knows the count of trees on land he's claiming might belong to someone else is not a man who is confused about the boundary. He is a man who has already decided he wants the trees." The room was quiet in the way rooms get when something true has been said out loud, that everyone in the room was already thinking. Mr. Crandall closed his satchel. He said that on review of the documentation, the matter appeared to be settled, and that he was sorry for the inconvenience. He stood up and he left, and the sound of his boots going down the porch steps was the sound of a problem closing behind it. Fitch sat for a moment longer. He started to speak twice and stopped twice. Then he picked up his hat and left as well. He did not put his hat on until he was halfway to his wagon, and this small detail was noted by Cora Bisson, who was carrying a bucket of water from the well, and watched the whole departure with the expressionless attention of a 15-year-old who is filing information away for future use. That was the afternoon the county would talk about later, the amber light through the slats, the dust in the air, the deed unrolled on the work table. Maren did not feel triumph in any way she had expected. She felt tired, and then very hungry, and then something quieter than either, the particular quality of settled that comes not from winning an argument, but from discovering the argument had already been won before it started, when she had gone to the county recorder's office in the very first month with her careful arithmetic and her willingness to pay for the survey that would have hurt to skip. August came over the ridge the next day, and she told him what had happened, and he listened without interrupting until she was done, and then he said what he had been going to say to her sooner or later, the thing he'd been waiting until she was ready to receive. He said, "The land knows who tends it, other people can learn to see it, but the land knows first." She understood by then what he was actually saying, which was not mystical at all. He was saying that the work itself was the evidence. He was saying that the trees were there, and they were producing, and they were hers, and every single one of those things was the result of specific choices, specific labor, specific arithmetic, calculated in the dark over 4 years, and that no man's smooth concern could outweigh any of it. She planted an additional 24 saplings that fall, bringing the total in the ground to 85. Cora helped her, and they worked in the clean October cold, the soil dark and ready from the summer's compost, each hole dug to the right depth, each sapling set in with the graft union above the soil line exactly as August had shown her in the kitchen with the lamp between them. When the last one was in and tamped and staked, Cora stood up and looked down the rows and said, with a 15-year-old's fine disregard for understatement, "That's a real orchard now." "It is," Maren said. The following summer arrived, in the way Missouri summers do, like an open door into a furnace, and the peaches that came off the trees that July were something that needed to be seen to be credited. 61 of the older trees in full production, the grafted ones adding their first real yield, and the quality. She had worried that the grafted trees might not hold the full character of the originals, that something might be lost in the translation from old wood to new. It was not lost. If anything, in the vigorous new root systems, in the ground she had spent 4 years feeding and reading and understanding, the fruit was better. It was more consistently sized, more uniformly ripe, the skin that same deep blush, the flesh that same yielding sweetness that concentrated itself in every bite like a summer's worth of patience paid out at once. Everett Cole came from Kansas City himself that August. He arrived in a rented buggy with a notebook and a manner of looking at the orchard that Maren recognized from her own first morning with the trees. The stillness that means you are in the presence of something that is going to change what you thought you knew. He walked the rows with her, and he counted the trees and tasted the fruit still warm from the branch, and he wrote numbers in his notebook for a long time without speaking. When he did speak, what he said was that he knew of 3 hotels in St. Louis and 2 in Chicago who would take everything she could produce at a price he named, which was not what she had been getting from the Kansas City order, which had already not been what anyone in Caldwell County would have believed a peach tree on thin ridge ground could generate. She asked him if he was certain about the Chicago buyers. He said they had already asked him where the fruit was coming from. She had reached, in the arithmetic she kept in no book anyone would find, a number she had set for herself in the first winter, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp and the debt column and the ledger that had looked purely terrifying. A number that had seemed then like a figure from a dream rather than a plan. She was past that number now. She had been past it for nearly a season. She did not gloat about this. There was no one to gloat to, and it was not her character. And being right was its own reply. What she did instead, that August, when the heat was at its fullest and the harvest was coming in faster than she and Cora and the 2 additional hands she'd hired could quite keep up with, was this. She went to Marcus Spicer at the feed store, and she bought supplies for the season at his regular price, without negotiation, and she paid in cash. And when he looked at her with the slightly dazed expression of a man revising a very old estimate, she said nothing particular except to ask whether his wife had received the jar of preserves she'd left on the store porch in June, which she had, and which Marcus Spicer confirmed had been eaten before supper the same evening it arrived. She went to the families she knew were carrying debt through the summer, the Bisson family, Cora's people, among them, and she offered work in the orchard at wages that were above what the county rate would have required, because she had enough margin now, and they did not, and because Cora had given her 4 years of honest labor and the integrity that went with it. She wrote to 2 young women in the county whom she knew had some capital and a willingness to work and no particular farm of their own, and she told them she had grafted saplings she would sell at fair cost, with the grafting knowledge included, and that the Caldwell County soil, thin and grudging as everyone said it was not as bad as its reputation if you were willing to give it what it needed. She told them this in plain terms, and she meant it. 15 orchards would eventually trace their rootstock back to Marin Harlow's East Ridge, though that accounting would take another decade to come clear. The first 5 of those were in Caldwell County, planted by women who had gotten their saplings from her and their grafting knowledge from the same winter kitchen sessions she had once had with August. The lamp on the table and the snow at the windows, and the knowledge moving from one set of hands to another the way it always does when someone decides to give it rather than keep it. August lived to see the 5th year of the expanded orchard, which was enough. He died in the winter of his 81st year, in his own house, in the particular peace of a man who has done what he meant to do. She carried a jar of the previous summer's preserves to his table and sat with him in those last weeks, and they talked about grafting and soil and patience and the taste of fruit grown in difficult ground. And he said again, near the end, what he had said in the very beginning, that in Hungary his father had grown something like this, that it had been abandoned because people decided it was not worth the trouble, that this was almost always a mistake, that the things worth most were often the ones that asked for more than people wanted to give. That is still true, she said. Yes, he said, it is always still true. The grave she put a single peach on in the summer, bright against the stone. Cora came with her, and neither of them said anything, and that was right. By the end of the decade, the name of the variety had been partially recovered. It appeared in a German-language fruit grower's almanac from 1847 under a name that translated approximately to the Patience peach, which Marin found so exactly correct that she simply adopted it, and by which name it would eventually appear in the catalogs of 2 regional nurseries in 1903, credited to the Harlow Orchard of Caldwell County, Missouri, 15 original specimens. The nursery description noted that the variety did not ship well and required attentive soil management, and rewarded both conditions with a fruit of exceptional early-season sweetness, and that demand exceeded supply by a considerable margin, and that grafted saplings were available from the Harlow orchard at a price that was, if you knew anything about what the fruit would yield, a genuine bargain. Gerald Fitch's produce operation had a difficult few years in the period following his attempt on Marin's East Ridge. Whether this was related to the fact that the county had understood, through the underground of county commerce, exactly what he had attempted, was a matter for debate. He was not ruined, but he was no longer the man who arrived at a farm door with his hat in his hands, and the quiet confidence that everyone had something they needed him for. He became, instead, a man who came to the Harlow orchard in the 5th year and asked to purchase the full run of her preserves at the price she set, and she sold them to him at that price, and she did not discuss what had happened between them, and neither did he, and that was the end of what there was between them. She did not require more from it than that. She was not a woman who needed the last word. She had the orchard. The farm that nobody had believed could produce anything sat in Caldwell County and produced, year upon year, the first ripe fruit of the season across a radius of 40 miles. The thing that arrived before anything else and reminded people what summer tasted like. And in those years when late frosts took the standard peach crops and left other orchards standing empty-handed and thin, the Harlow trees on their east ridge, sheltered by the tree line her uncle had been too worn to clear and she had been too far-sighted to touch, came through with their fruit intact, and the arithmetic of that particular vindication spoke for itself without any help from her. She rose before light. She worked with her hands until they went rough as bark. She watched the quiet economy others walked past without looking, and she reasoned her way to value where everyone else had seen only liability. She kept her early success as you keep a coal banked low under ash, warm and waiting, until the ground was ready and the moment was right, and there was no question at all of what she had made from what they had called nothing. And when the moment came, she did not exploit it. She shared it, the saplings, the knowledge, the fair wages, the honest prices. And what came back from that sharing was the one thing no man with a leather satchel and a county form could have filed a claim on. It was the trust of the ground itself and of the people who worked it. It was the thing August had said at the very beginning, in the way August said things that required a few years to fully unfold. The land knows who tends it. Other people can learn to see it, but the land knows first. The 15 trees stood on the ridge for another 30 years, the oldest of them, the original ones, their bark gone deeply furrowed and gray as old iron, their yield diminished with age, but not gone, not ever fully gone, still putting out fruit every July that tasted exactly the way it had always tasted, like patience rendered into sweetness, like the thing you make of a difficult ground when you decide it is worth the trouble after all.